September 15, 1944. 600 hours. Peleliu Island, Palau. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched in his coral-reinforced bunker watching the American amphibious force approach through the dawn. He felt no fear. His position had been prepared for 3 months. Walls were 3 feet of reinforced coral, thick enough to withstand direct artillery hits. Overlapping fields of fire covered every approach. His garrison had supplies for extended defense. They had prepared for everything the Americans could bring. At 6:12 hours, an M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun opened fire from an approaching Amtrak. The sound was different from anything Yamamoto had heard before, not the methodical crack of rifle fire or the rapid chatter of light machine guns. This was a deep, hammering roar that seemed to shake the air itself. The first burst struck the coral face of his bunker. Yamamoto expected the rounds to ricochet or crater the surface as rifle bullets had done during test firing. Instead, the coral exploded. The .50 caliber rounds, each weighing over 2 ounces and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, didn't just impact the fortification. They punched through. Chunks of coral the size of fists shattered inward. The supposedly impregnable wall that had taken weeks to construct was disintegrating under sustained fire. Within 4 minutes, Yamamoto's entire defensive line, 12 bunkers that had seemed invincible, was compromised. Marines were advancing through gaps. The .50 cal had carved in fortifications designed to stop them. That night, in a journal entry that would be found after his death 2 weeks later, Yamamoto wrote a phrase that would appear in dozens of captured Japanese documents across the Pacific. Akuma no buki, the devil's weapon. He described not just the physical destruction but the psychological impact. Our fortifications meant nothing. Our courage meant nothing. We prepared for battle, but the Americans brought hell. This is the story of the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun and how it fundamentally altered Pacific warfare. Not through revolutionary technology, but through the devastating application of industrial capacity to create sustained firepower that Japanese defensive doctrine had no answer for. The weapon Japanese soldiers called Jigoku no Kikai, Hell's Machine, didn't just destroy fortifications. It destroyed the entire tactical framework that Japanese forces had built their defense strategy around. To understand why the M2 Browning had such devastating psychological and tactical impact, you must understand Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific War. By 1944, Japan had learned that trying to stop American invasions at the beach was suicidal. American naval gunfire and air superiority made beach defenses death traps. The new doctrine, developed after studying American tactics in the Solomons and Gilberts, emphasized defense in depth from fortified positions inland. The philosophy was sound. Let Americans land. Allow them to penetrate beyond naval gunfire support. Then engage them from prepared fortifications in terrain that negated American advantages in armor and air power. Japanese engineers became expert at using natural terrain, caves, coral ridges, volcanic rock, to create defensive positions that were extraordinarily difficult to destroy with conventional weapons. On Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had implemented this doctrine perfectly. The island's coral ridges were honeycombed with caves and tunnels. Bunkers were dug deep into coral formations, with walls 3 to 4 feet thick. Firing ports were minimal, making direct hits nearly impossible. Each position was mutually supporting, allowing defenders to cover each other. The entire system was designed to survive artillery bombardment and force Americans into close combat, where Japanese determination and willingness to die would offset American material advantages. Japanese defensive calculations were based on experience fighting American forces throughout 1943 and early 1944. They knew American artillery was devastating, but understood that indirect fire had limited effectiveness against deep fortifications. They knew American air power was overwhelming, but recognized that bombs and rockets couldn't penetrate properly constructed bunkers. They knew American infantry had excellent small arms, but calculated that rifle-caliber weapons couldn't breach thick coral walls. What Japanese planners hadn't adequately accounted for was the M2 Browning and how Americans would employ it. The weapon itself wasn't new. It had been designed by John Moses Browning in the 1920s and adopted by the U.S. military in 1933. But its application in Pacific Island warfare, particularly when mounted on amphibious tractors and tanks, created capabilities that shattered Japanese defensive assumptions. The M2 Browning fired the .50 BMG Browning machine gun cartridge, a round originally designed for anti-aircraft use. The bullet weighed 1.7 ounces, over 4 times heavier than the .30 caliber rounds fired by most infantry weapons. It left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, carrying enormous kinetic energy. At impact, each round delivered roughly 13,000 foot-pounds of energy, approximately 4 times what a .30 caliber round delivered. But the real devastation came from sustained fire. The M2 could fire 455 rounds per minute and could maintain this rate for extended periods. Unlike lighter machine guns that overheated quickly, the M2's heavy barrel and robust construction allowed for sustained fire that could literally chew through fortifications. And unlike every other machine gun in widespread use, the M2 could be supplied with effectively unlimited ammunition through American logistics networks. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 92 7.7 heavy machine gun, were effective weapons by conventional standards, but they fired rifle-caliber rounds that couldn't penetrate thick fortifications. Japanese doctrine emphasized controlled, aimed fire to conserve ammunition. American doctrine with the M2 emphasized sustained suppressive fire, with ammunition supply being nearly unlimited. The philosophical difference was profound. When Marines landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944, they brought 48 M2 Brownings mounted on LVT Amtraks and Sherman tanks. Behind them, logistics vessels carried 1.8 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, 500 rounds per gun. This wasn't careful ammunition management. This was American industrial capacity translated into tactical reality. Gunners could fire continuously, knowing resupply was immediate and unlimited. The first day's combat revealed the tactical revolution. Japanese bunkers that had been designed to withstand artillery bombardment discovered that sustained .50 caliber fire could achieve what explosive shells could not. The armor-piercing rounds didn't need direct hits on firing ports. They could chew through coral walls, creating gaps that made positions untenable. After 4 or 5 minutes of sustained fire, impregnable bunkers had basketball-sized holes in their walls. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immediate and devastating. Private Tadashi Okamoto, whose diary was captured after the battle, described the experience. The American Devil machine began firing at our position. The sound alone was terrifying, a continuous roaring that seemed to come from everywhere. Then the walls began breaking, not slowly but quickly. Chunks of coral fell inward. We could see daylight through holes that grew larger with each burst. We had believed we were safe. We were not safe. Nothing was safe. The tactical implications emerged quickly. Japanese defensive positions depended on mutual support, bunkers covering each other's approaches. But when M2S could suppress or penetrate multiple positions simultaneously, the entire defensive network collapsed. Marines would advance behind .50 caliber fire, using the sustained suppression to close to flamethrower or demolition range. Japanese defenders faced an impossible choice: remain in positions being carved apart by .50 cal fire, or expose themselves to riflemen by attempting to reposition. Colonel Nakagawa, commanding Peleliu's defenders, had prepared for American tactics he'd studied in previous campaigns. He expected frontal assaults that would be repelled with heavy casualties. He expected artillery duels where his dispersed positions would survive. He expected close combat where Japanese determination would offset American firepower. What he faced instead was systematic destruction, where his preparations and his soldiers' courage were irrelevant. American tactics evolved rapidly to exploit the M2's capabilities. Tank-mounted .50 cals would suppress Japanese positions while infantry advanced. Once infantry secured areas near bunkers, the .50 cals would resume fire, not trying to kill defenders directly, but making positions uninhabitable. The sustained fire, sometimes lasting 10 or 15 minutes on a single bunker, created conditions where Japanese defenders either died in collapsing fortifications or were forced to evacuate into American fields of fire. The ammunition expenditure would have been impossible for any other military. American forces on Peleliu fired approximately 1.5 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the two-month battle. This averaged to over 31,000 rounds per M2 Browning, enough to fire continuously for over an hour per gun. The Japanese, who carefully rationed every round due to supply constraints, couldn't conceptualize this level of expenditure. Their doctrine assumed ammunition limitations would constrain American fire. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. By the third day of battle, captured Japanese communications revealed psychological breakdown. Radio intercepts showed positions reporting continuous hell fire, and positions destroyed despite artillery-proof construction. Some Japanese officers reported that their men were abandoning positions not because they feared death, but because the positions offered no protection. Dying in combat was acceptable within Japanese military culture. Dying helplessly while coral walls disintegrated around them was psychologically unbearable. The battle for Bloody Nose Ridge demonstrated the M2's psychological impact most clearly. The ridge was Peleliu's strongest defensive position, honeycombed with caves and bunkers in coral formations. Japanese forces had prepared it as their final defensive line, confident that the terrain made American armor and heavy weapons ineffective. But Marines brought M2S forward on tripods, establishing firing positions that could engage cave entrances and bunker apertures with sustained fire. The tactic wasn't to penetrate caves with direct fire. It was to make cave entrances unusable. Sustained .50 caliber fire would chew apart the coral around cave mouths, collapsing edges and creating rockfalls. Japanese defenders inside caves were safe from the rounds themselves, but found their entrances blocked or exposed. They couldn't return fire without exposing themselves. They couldn't evacuate without climbing through killing zones. They were entombed in positions that had become coffins. Lieutenant Yamamoto's final journal entries, written in mid-September before his death, captured the despair. The American machine makes courage meaningless. Our men are brave. They do not fear death, but they cannot fight what they cannot see, cannot reach, cannot affect. The devil weapon fires from distances where our weapons are useless. It destroys positions we believed were indestructible. It continues firing long after any weapon we possess would be silenced by overheating or ammunition shortage. We are not being defeated. We are being processed. The word processed appeared in multiple captured Japanese documents. It reflected understanding that they weren't engaged in battle as they conceptualized it. Battle implied mutual action, attack and defense, courage and skill determining outcomes. What they faced was industrial procedure, systematic application of overwhelming firepower that reduced their positions to rubble regardless of how well they fought. The psychological collapse manifested in unprecedented ways. Japanese military culture emphasized fighting to the death, with surrender being unthinkable shame. Yet at Peleliu, over 300 Japanese soldiers surrendered, an extraordinary number by Pacific War standards. Interrogations revealed common themes. They hadn't surrendered because they were cowards. They surrendered because continued resistance was psychologically impossible. Staying in positions being systematically destroyed by weapons they couldn't counter drove men to choices their culture had conditioned them to see as worse than death. Technical analysis of destroyed Japanese fortifications after Peleliu revealed why the M2 was so effective. Coral, while strong under compression, was brittle under impact. The .50 caliber round's combination of mass and velocity created shock waves that fractured coral structure. Each impact weakened the surrounding material. Sustained fire on the same area created cascading failure where chunks would break away. Fortifications that could withstand explosive blast forces from artillery shells couldn't withstand kinetic impact from sustained machine gun fire. American Afteraction reports documented the tactical evolution. Initially, Marines used the M2 as they had used heavy machine guns in previous campaigns for suppressive fire against area targets. But Peleliu taught them that sustained direct fire could destroy fortifications. By the battle's end, standard procedure was to identify Japanese positions, bring M2S to positions with clear sight lines, and fire continuously until the positions collapsed or were evacuated. The technique wasn't subtle, but it was devastatingly effective. The industrial dimension of American M2 employment extended beyond ammunition supply. When M2S were damaged or destroyed, rare occurrences given the weapon's robust construction, they were replaced within hours. American logistics could deliver new weapons faster than Japanese forces could destroy them. When barrels wore out from sustained fire, they were swapped with spares that were stockpiled at every supply point. The Japanese had no equivalent logistics capability. Damaged weapons often couldn't be replaced. Worn barrels couldn't be changed. The disparity in support infrastructure was as devastating as the disparity in firepower. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 saw the M2's psychological impact reach full development. Japanese defenders had studied Peleliu and understood the .50 caliber threat. They dug deeper, used thicker walls, created more complex tunnel systems. But American employment evolved correspondingly. M2S were used in pairs or groups, with overlapping fields of fire ensuring no position was safe. The sustained fire would last longer, sometimes half an hour or more on particularly stubborn positions. Japanese defenders found that no fortification, no matter how carefully prepared, could withstand indefinite .50 caliber fire backed by unlimited ammunition. Captain Koichi Ito, who survived Okinawa and was interviewed after the war, described the psychological erosion. On the first day, we believed we could resist. Our positions were strong. We were determined. But the hell machines began firing and they never stopped. Not after minutes. Not after hours. Positions that had taken months to build were destroyed in days. Men who would have died charging the enemy fled from positions being torn apart around them. It wasn't cowardice. It was recognition that we were helpless. The testimony of Japanese survivors consistently emphasized helplessness, not fear. Fear was acceptable in Japanese military culture. Courage meant acting despite fear. Helplessness was unbearable, the understanding that no action could change outcomes. American firepower, particularly the M2's sustained destructive capability, created helplessness. Japanese defenders couldn't suppress the guns with return fire because of the range advantage. They couldn't destroy the guns because they were mounted on armored vehicles. They couldn't wait out the fire because American ammunition was unlimited. They could only endure until their positions collapsed, then die or surrender. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. Japanese defensive doctrine for the entire Pacific theater was based on making American advances costly enough to force negotiated peace. Each island would be a fortress, extracting maximum casualties, buying time for diplomatic solutions or military miracles. The calculation required that Japanese defenders could inflict casualties proportional to their numbers through prepared defensive fighting. The M2 Browning, employed with American logistical support and tactical doctrine that emphasized sustained suppressive fire, broke this calculation. American casualties on Peleliu and Okinawa, while significant, were far lower than Japanese planners had projected based on fortification strength and defender determination. The .50 caliber allowed Americans to destroy positions that should have required costly frontal assaults. Japanese defenders died in their fortifications rather than inflicting casualties in close combat. The strategic exchange rate shifted decisively in America's favor. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military historians identified the M2 Browning as one of the key weapons that made Japanese defensive strategy unworkable. Not because it was technologically revolutionary. The design was relatively simple and had existed for years before the Pacific War. But because American industrial capacity allowed employment at scale with unlimited ammunition, creating sustained firepower that Japanese fortifications couldn't withstand and Japanese psychology couldn't process. The weapon remained in service with American forces for over 80 years after World War II, seeing combat in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Its longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of Browning's design, but its impact in the Pacific War was unique because it represented the intersection of technical capability, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine that created effects beyond what the weapon itself could achieve in isolation. For Japanese defenders in the Pacific, the M2 became symbolic of why they were losing. It wasn't just superior. It represented a form of warfare where their traditional military values, courage, determination, willingness to die, were rendered meaningless by industrial and technological disparity. A Japanese soldier could be as brave as humanly possible and still die helplessly in a collapsing bunker, unable to affect the outcome through any action within his power. The phrase Akuma no buki, devil's weapon, appeared in captured documents from Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other late-war battles. It wasn't a term of respect for enemy weaponry. It was expression of psychological trauma from facing a weapon that made everything they had prepared, everything they believed about warfare, irrelevant. The devil wasn't the machine itself. It was what the machine represented. Industrial warfare taken to its logical conclusion, where human courage became insufficient. Lieutenant Yamamoto's final journal entry, dated September 29, 1944, 2 days before he was killed, captured this understanding. We were told that spirit would overcome material, that Japanese determination would defeat American wealth, but the devil weapons prove this is a lie. Our spirit is strong. Our determination is absolute. But we die anyway, torn apart by weapons we cannot fight, supplied by industry we cannot match, employed by doctrine we cannot counter. The Americans have not defeated our courage. They have made courage irrelevant. The M2 Browning didn't win the Pacific War alone. No single weapon could. But it was instrumental in solving the tactical problem that Japanese defensive doctrine had created. By making fortifications that should have been impregnable vulnerable to sustained fire, and by making that sustained fire possible through industrial ammunition supply, the M2 allowed American forces to advance with casualties far below what Japanese planners had considered necessary to force negotiated peace. For the Marines and soldiers who employed the M2, it was a tool that saved American lives by making Japanese positions untenable without costly assaults. For the Japanese soldiers who faced it, it was hell's machine, a weapon that destroyed not just their fortifications but their entire framework for understanding warfare. The psychological impact of the M2, the understanding that courage and preparation weren't enough against unlimited industrial firepower, contributed to the collapse of Japanese will to resist that characterized the war's final year. Technical specifications: 50 caliber, 455 50 rounds per minute, effective range to 2,000 yards. Don't capture what made the M2 psychologically devastating. What mattered was sustained fire backed by unlimited ammunition, destroying fortifications that defenders had believed were invincible. What mattered was the sound of continuous hammering that lasted not seconds or minutes but tens of minutes, reducing coral walls to rubble while defenders watched helplessly. What mattered was the recognition that no defensive preparation could withstand this weapon when employed with American logistical support. The final accounting showed the M2's impact clearly. Battles where it was employed heavily, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, saw higher Japanese surrender rates and lower American casualties per Japanese defender killed than earlier campaigns. The weapon hadn't made killing easier in the sense of increasing lethality per round. It had made Japanese defensive positions untenable, forcing defenders to evacuate into fields of fire or remain in positions being destroyed around them. Either choice typically ended in death or surrender, but neither allowed the close combat where Japanese tactical doctrine assumed they would inflict maximum casualties. In post-war interviews, Japanese veterans consistently identified the M2 as one of the most psychologically difficult weapons to face. More than flamethrowers, which were terrifying but could be countered with proper positions. More than artillery, which was destructive but survivable in deep fortifications. More than aircraft, which were devastating but intermittent. The M2's combination of sustained fire, penetrative power, and unlimited ammunition created helplessness that was psychologically unbearable. The American advantage wasn't just having the weapon. It was having the industrial capacity to supply ammunition in quantities that made sustained fire tactically viable, and the tactical doctrine that emphasized suppression over careful ammunition conservation. Japanese forces had machine guns that were effective by world standards. What they lacked was the logistical infrastructure to support sustained fire, and the tactical philosophy that viewed ammunition as an expendable resource, rather than a precious commodity to be carefully rationed. This represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached warfare. Japan's limited industrial capacity meant every round, every weapon, every resource had to be used carefully. Conservation and efficiency were necessities. America's vast industrial capacity meant resources could be employed lavishly. Suppressive fire using thousands of rounds to destroy a single bunker wasn't wasteful. It was tactically sound if it saved American lives and ammunition was unlimited. The M2 Browning became the physical manifestation of this philosophical difference. In Japanese hands, such a weapon would have been carefully employed, with fire discipline conserving ammunition for critical moments. In American hands, backed by industrial logistics, it became a tool for sustained destruction that could be applied continuously until targets ceased to exist. The same weapon, employed with different logistical support and tactical doctrine, created fundamentally different capabilities. For the Japanese soldiers who called it Akuma no buki, the devil wasn't in the technical specifications. The devil was in what the weapon revealed about the war they were fighting. They were brave. They were determined. They were well-trained. But they were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity allowed employment of weapons at scale and intensity that made traditional military virtues insufficient. Courage couldn't stop .50 caliber rounds. Determination couldn't rebuild coral walls being chewed apart. Discipline couldn't make limited ammunition comparable to unlimited supply. The M2 Browning's legacy in the Pacific War was teaching both sides what industrial-age warfare meant in practical terms. For Americans, it demonstrated that technical capability combined with industrial logistics could solve tactical problems through sustained application of firepower. For Japanese, it demonstrated that defensive doctrine based on fortifications and determination couldn't withstand enemies who could bring unlimited firepower to bear. The lessons shaped how both nations approached military planning for generations afterward. When the last Japanese positions on Okinawa were cleared in June 1945, ending major combat in the Pacific, The M2 Browning had been instrumental in every major battle since Peleliu. It hadn't won the war that required combined arms, strategic bombing, naval blockade, and ultimately atomic weapons. But it had made Japanese defensive doctrine unworkable, forcing them into tactical situations where their strengths couldn't be applied and their weaknesses were exposed. In doing so, it hastened the conclusion that was probably inevitable, but might have taken far longer and cost far more lives without weapons like it. The devil's weapon, Hell's machine, the gun that made courage irrelevant. These weren't just colorful descriptions from traumatized Japanese soldiers. They were accurate assessments of what the M2 Browning represented, the point where industrial capacity translated into tactical capability that traditional military virtues couldn't counter. The weapon itself was just steel and mechanical action. What made it devastating was everything behind it: the factories producing ammunition, the logistics delivering it, the doctrine employing it, and the industrial philosophy that made unlimited expenditure tactically viable. Lieutenant Yamamoto didn't live to see Japan's surrender. He died in his bunker on Peleliu, position collapsed by sustained .50 caliber fire, embodying the truth he had written in his journal. Courage had become irrelevant, not because Japanese soldiers lacked it, but because they faced a form of warfare where courage alone couldn't change outcomes. The Americans had brought hell to the Pacific Islands, not through cruelty but through systematic application of industrial firepower that made resistance meaningless. The M2 Browning was the instrument of that hell, and Japanese soldiers who survived it never forgot the sound of the devil's weapon.